If you have studied or are familiar with the history of the American frontier, then you have probably heard the phrase, Boot Hill Cemetery. But what exactly is a Boot Hill Cemetery, and what is the history behind it? Simply put, a Boot Hill Cemetery is what is known as a potter's field, a place to bury those who have died, who are either poor, without family, are criminals, or whose identities are unknown. A potter's field is for people who are either forgotten or shunned by society. The graves are simple, and the grounds oftentimes neglected. A Boot Hill Cemetery is a specific variation of a potter's field, one that was found on the American frontier. The added twist is that the majority of those buried at a Boot Hill died violent deaths, a collection of outlaws and victims. Not everyone buried at a Boot Hill necessarily died violently, but the name and legacy of a Boot Hill is that of violence in the American frontier. So why is it called a Boot Hill? Let's first look at the second part of the name, hill. Why would a potter's field be located on a hill? Cemeteries have long been traditionally located on hills, and for a variety of reasons. First, for drainage purposes. If the soil around graves becomes saturated, pressure can cause coffins to be forced out of the ground. Secondly, hilltops are not easily utilized as farmland and make tilling difficult, and so that part of the land was considered to be more expendable. Finally, burials on hills meant the deceased were closer to the sky, and as the sky is associated with heaven, then the bodies of the deceased were closer to God. It was natural for those in the American frontier, when looking for places to start a cemetery, to find the nearest hill and begin there. So why is it called a Boot Hill? There are two phrases that explain the boot portion of the name. They are similar and yet different in connotation. These are died with their boots on and buried with their boots on. To die with your boots on refers to an unnatural death. If you were sick with a deadly illness, or if you died peacefully in your sleep, then you would either be at home or in a hospital, most likely in bed and without wearing shoes or boots. Although people who die from accidents or other external causes, like a blizzard for example, die with their boots on, the phrase mostly refers to violent deaths from the hands of another person. The phrase, die with your boots on, comes from an earlier phrase, to die in one's shoes, or to die in one's boots, which refers to being hanged, and so the phrase has traditionally been seen negatively. The phrase was used widely in the American West, and some people began to see it from a different perspective. Bill Tillman, famous lawman of the Wild West, told a friend that he actually wanted to die with his boots on, and not in bed like an old woman. And so some thought to die with their boots on to be a badge of honor, that they were cut down in the prime of their life doing the dangerous work they were famous for. Bill Tillman would die with his boots on in Cromwell, Oklahoma in 1924. The phrase, buried with their boots on, has a slightly different meaning. Besides the literal interpretation that a person was buried wearing boots, it means that the body of the deceased was not properly prepared for burial, that they were buried in the exact same condition in which they died, wearing the same clothes and footwear as they had when they were killed. Many frontier towns with a Boot Hill cemetery were in their infancy, and so professional undertakers were probably not available. Even if they were available, the deceased may not have had friends or family that cared about giving them a proper funeral, or they were outlaws, and so the townspeople viewed them unfavorably and just wanted to get rid of the body in the cheapest and quickest way possible. And so they were buried unceremoniously, oftentimes in shallow graves with crude grave markers. To be buried with your boots on was seen negatively, but over the years, the meaning has changed somewhat. In more recent times, many cowboys consider it to be true Old West style to be buried with their boots on. To be buried wearing the same clothes and boots that they sported during their life is viewed as being more genuine and more true to their character. So what was the first cemetery in the West known as a Boot Hill? The title of the first Boot Hill normally goes to Hays, Kansas, known as Hays City in its wild frontier days. The Boot Hill Cemetery in Hays City began the same year as the town, 1867. Hays would become famous for the violence on its streets, best summarized by this photograph, taken in 1873, of 2 dead soldiers killed in a gunfight right outside Cy Goddard's Saloon and Dance Hall. Hays would also become famous for 3 men that visited and lived in the area: George Armstrong Custer, Buffalo Bill Cody, and Wild Bill Hickok. Hickok served as acting sheriff of Ellis County, even though he wasn't elected. While a lawman, Hickok shot 4 men in Hays City, 3 of them dying from their wounds. 2 of them would be buried at the Boot Hill Cemetery, north of town. There are cemeteries called Boot Hill in the West that predate the Boot Hill at Hays City, such as Florence, Idaho, which began in 1861. More than likely, these earlier cemeteries were called Boot Hills after the phrase had already become popular and spread throughout the West. It makes sense that Hays City would have the first Boot Hill Cemetery, because some of its residents would leave Hays in 1872 and move southwest to the new frontier town of Dodge City. Dodge City is famous for its Boot Hill Cemetery, and with people moving from Hays to Dodge, the tradition of naming the local Pottersfield Boot Hill was carried on. After Dodge City's notorious Boot Hill began, other famous towns would also have a Boot Hill Cemetery, most notably Deadwood, South Dakota, and Tombstone, Arizona. However, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Lots of frontier towns had cemeteries called Boot Hill. Although this list is incomplete, here are some of the towns with a Boot Hill cemetery. The ghost town of Alma, located in Catron County, New Mexico, has a Boot Hill located approximately 2 miles north of the town. The cemetery and town date back to the 1880s. Billings, Montana has a Boot Hill Cemetery near the intersection of Main Street and Airport Road. The cemetery is actually from the town of Colson, the first town in the area. The town of Colson lasted from 1877 to 1882. The ghost town of Bodie, California, has a Boot Hill Cemetery. Bodie was a gold mining town whose population peaked at 10,000 in 1879 and 1880. Large-scale mining efforts ended in 1915, and by the 1950s, all forms of mining had stopped. There is a Boot Hill outside of the ghost town of Bonanza, Idaho. Bonanza began in 1877, the first major settlement in the area. Much of the town burned in a fire in 1889. By 1910, most of the town was abandoned. The ghost town of Calico, California, has a cemetery a quarter mile away, called the Calico Cemetery, or sometimes Boot Hill. Calico was a silver mining town built in 1881, and abandoned in the mid-1890s. There is a very small Boot Hill Cemetery in Canyon City, Oregon. The cemetery has only 4 graves: 2 men who were hanged for stealing horses, and 2 women who were prostitutes. Canyon City was a gold mining town established in 1862. Today, it has a population around 700 people. The Mount Moriah Cemetery at Deadwood, South Dakota, is also called Deadwood's Boot Hill. Mount Moriah was started in 1878 and was actually the 3rd cemetery in Deadwood. The Ingleside Cemetery and Catholic Cemetery predate it. But as the area of the Ingleside Cemetery was more useful for building houses, the bodies there were moved up the hill to Mount Moriah. Dodge City, Kansas has already been mentioned as having a Boot Hill Cemetery. It was an active cemetery from 1872 until 1878. In 1879, the bodies at Boot Hill were moved to the new cemetery, Prairie Grove Cemetery. The Concordia Cemetery at El Paso, Texas, is nicknamed El Paso's Boot Hill. The first burial there was in 1856. However, the cemetery did not gain widespread use until the 1880s. Over 60,000 people are buried there, including John Wesley Hardin and lawman John Selman. At Guthrie, Oklahoma's Summit View Cemetery, there is a special section of the cemetery called Boot Hill. The Summit View Cemetery began in June 1890, and the Boot Hill section contains the graves of many outlaws, most notably Bill Doolin of the Doolin Gang. The town of Hartville, Wyoming, besides having a history of gunfights on its streets, had a Boot Hill cemetery. Hartville was first settled by prospectors in the 1870s, and today still has a small population. Hays, Kansas is the site of the original Boot Hill Cemetery. It was an active place for burials from 1867 until 1874, when the Mount Allen Cemetery was created. Martin Allen was an important real estate developer in the area, and when his daughter Clara died, he did not want to bury her with the outlaws and prostitutes of Boot Hill, and so Mount Allen Cemetery began. Just outside of Idaho City, Idaho, lies the Pioneer Cemetery, also known as Boot Hill Cemetery. Idaho City was originally known as the town of Bannock and was founded in 1862 during the area's gold rush. About 480 people still live in Idaho City today. Ogallala, Nebraska had a Boot Hill north of the original settlement. Ogallala was famous as a cow town from the 1870s to 1890 and was known as the gateway of the Northern Plains. Here, Wyoming, Montana, and Texas cowboys gathered to buy and sell herds of cattle. 175 miles north of Las Vegas is the frontier town of Pioche, Nevada. Outside of Pioche, on Boot Hill Cemetery Road, is their Boot Hill Cemetery. Pioche grew into a large mining town in the early 1870s, and mine owners began paying gunmen in order to protect mining claims. Violence among the miners ensued, and victims of homicide were laid to rest at Boot Hill. There is a special section of the Boot Hill Cemetery named Murderers Row, where many violent individuals are buried. Sidney, Nebraska has a Boot Hill Cemetery that has existed since 1868. Sidney, Nebraska, nicknamed Sinful Sidney, became an important town from 1876 to 1881, as it was the closest shipping point on the Union Pacific Railroad to transport the gold discovered in the Black Hills. In the panhandle of Texas lies the ghost town of Tascosa, Texas. Tascosa was a stop for cowboys driving cattle up from the greater part of Texas. Tascosa has its own Boot Hill Cemetery, which started with the death of saloon keeper Bob Russell in March of 1881. It was located on a hill west of town. Tascosa's close proximity to Dodge City shows how the name of Boot Hill began to be dispersed to all corners of the frontier. Tin Cup, Colorado, founded in 1879, has its own Boot Hill Cemetery. The town was originally named Virginia City, but as there were other Virginia cities in other states, it was renamed to Tin Cup, named after Tin Cup Gulch, because when prospector Jim Taylor discovered gold there, he carried it back in a tin cup. Town Marshal Harry Rivers, who was killed by a saloon keeper in 1882, is one of the people buried at the Boot Hill Cemetery. One of the more famous Boot Hill cemeteries is the one at Tombstone, Arizona. The Boot Hill at Tombstone began in 1878 on a hill northwest of town and continued to be used until 1884. This is where Billy Clanton and Frank and Tom McLaury are buried after the famous gunfight at the OK Corral. Like many of the cemeteries in the United States that are now commonly called Boot Hill, the Tombstone Boot Hill wasn't originally called that. It was first known as the City Cemetery and then called the Old Cemetery. Around 1929, people began to call it the Boot Hill Cemetery. Even though it wasn't originally called Boot Hill, it still retained all the hallmarks of a Boot Hill, a cemetery on a hill with burials of many people who died violently. Virginia City, Montana has a Boot Hill Cemetery that was started in 1864 with the burial of 5 road agents who were hanged by vigilantes. The cemetery also contains the graves of William and Clara Dalton, who died of natural causes in 1864. Other people were buried there, however, their names have been lost to history. Virginia City grew as an important town after gold was discovered in the area in 1863. Other towns that are said to have a Boot Hill Cemetery include, and I am sure there are many more cemeteries in the United States that have at one time or another been called Boot Hill. As you've seen, some of the cemeteries mentioned have been called Boot Hill from the very beginning, such as the Boot Hill in Hays City and the Boot Hill in Dodge City. Other cemeteries were originally called something different, and then after the term Boot Hill became popular, then began to be called a Boot Hill. This includes the cemetery at Tombstone, Arizona. The term Boot Hill has been prevalent in any media associated with the Wild West. Several movies have the phrase Boot Hill in the name. These include Boot Hill Brigade, 1937, Boot Hill Bandits, 1942, Last Days of Boot Hill, 1947, Showdown at Boot Hill, 1958, Boot Hill, 1969. But Boot Hill cemeteries can be found in many westerns, both in movies and on television. In music, there are several songs with the phrase Boot Hill in them. In 1959, Carl Perkins wrote the song The Ballad of Boot Hill. It was recorded by Johnny Cash and released that same year. And so the phrase Boot Hill is very important in studying and understanding the Wild West and its legacy. It was used during the time of the frontier, but grew even more popular in the years that followed. There are Boot Hills all over the United States. Some originally named that, and others would later be known with that name. But no matter when the name was applied, Boot Hill conjures up a time of violence, when people were killed on the streets in gunfights, and buried unceremoniously at the nearest hilltop.